is no problem too large for government to solve and no concern too small for it to care about.
A voice that most people, most sane, rational people, smart people, agree is one of the most conservative voices in the state of Wisconsin and beyond.
WILL is an indispensable organization.
The essential mission is to keep the republic.
Well, welcome back to If You Can Keep It, a podcast created by the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. This is WILL Communications Director Pat Garrett, and joining me as always is WILL President Rick Esenberg for another episode. Last time we talked about the Wisconsin Supreme Court election and how politics drives those elections and those conversations far more than legal philosophy. So give that episode a listen if you haven't. But today we're talking about a technological shift that is fundamentally reshaping our world, and that's the rise of artificial intelligence. AI is no longer a science fiction concept. It's here. It's remaking much of the economy and creating questions about the future of capitalism, government involvement, the economy, where people are going to work, how people will earn a living, and so much more. So joining us today is Neil Chilson. He's a lawyer, a computer scientist. He's the head of AI policy at the Abundance Institute. He spent a career clearing away legal and social hurdles to help people invent, innovate, and find a new way to help people thrive. He's also the author of the book, Getting Out of Control, Emergent Leadership in a Complex World. And so thanks for being with us today, Neil. And Rick, we're glad to have you back.
Glad to be here.
We'll start with this first question. AI, how long will it be before AI is just an everyday tool necessary into everybody's daily lives? I think we're getting there, but I think it's something that people talk about in the context of years and months. And actually, it's going to be a lot quicker than that. So why don't you start with that?
Yeah, it's great to be on, and I'm super excited to be talking to this audience about this issue. I spend every day thinking about it. And let me just start with a little bit of background, which is that it really depends on how you define AI. Artificial intelligence, the term was coined in the 1950s by John McCarthy, a Dartmouth College professor. And John subsequently said that every single time something works, we stop calling it AI. And that has been the history of AI research. So, cutting edge research, AI research, when I was a kid, part of what got me interested in computers, I have a computer science background, at the cutting edge then was chess playing games, right? It was a big news when IBM's computer beat Garry Kasparov and won at chess. And so now our phones, pretty much everybody's phones has an app on it that could play chess better than almost every single human on the planet. We don't really talk about chess games as AI anymore, but they were a cutting edge part of research. And that's been the history of AI. So I think sometimes, there's a way in which you could say that AI is already ubiquitous. This in our everyday lives. This device, I'm holding up a phone for the listeners, full of artificial intelligence algorithms that do everything from recognize your voice to unlock when it sees your face, to transcribe text, to do automated translation between different languages. All of this was cutting edge AI research at some point. And now it just works and we just call it computers. So I think in some ways it would be take the temperature down in the policy debate a little bit if we didn't, instead of saying AI, we talked about advanced computing, because in many ways that's what we're talking about here. Now, there has been a change. There's been a recent new development in the technology, and AI has gone through these types of hype cycles in the past. And I don't want to say that this is exactly the same as all of those, because I do think there are some unique characteristics to this one that mean it will have big impacts, but I think it is useful to understand that context. And so the current wave of AI does something slightly different than in the past. In the past, we basically had to give the computer every single piece of instructions about what to do in order to be smart. Now we have a technique called machine learning. It's kind of old, but it's gotten stronger more recently. And ChatGPT was a sort of launch of it into the public space for most people. And what this does is, rather than the programmer giving a bunch of instructions and then the computer processing data using those instructions, what we do is we provide a ton of data to the computer and it learns the patterns in that data. And so this is sort of like if I asked you to write down all of the connections between the words cat and dog. And there's so many, like when I ask that, you could immediately think there's all these different ways you might connect those. You might be like, well, they're both animals, they're both mammals. Those are some very obvious close connections, but you might also have things like, well, they both have three letters. They both have a vowel in them. They are known as antagonists in the natural, world. There's all these connections that you and I could draw between these two concepts. That learning process is what the computers learn over and over and over from dumping tons and tons of data into them. They learn all these connections between different concepts. And then when I put a prompt into something like ChatGPT, using those connections that it understands between all these different concepts, it provides what it thinks is like a reasonable response. And I think the thing that's been very surprising about this machine learning context is that it works better than people thought it would, right? I think people are very surprised that you can now generate entire books. Frankly, you could generate an entire book under the current technology, by giving a detailed prompt about what you want and extracting that out. And the book would seem, it would read very well. The English would be all very well formatted. It may have original, what look like original ideas to you or original combinations of ideas. But I think a lot of people would be hard pressed to say like this is fundamentally different than a book that like an average person might write. So I think that there are, I think that capability, the fact that we can do this just by learning a lot of patterns and then putting scaffolding around it, I think is surprising. It raises a lot of opportunities for people, and it raises a lot of concerns as well. And so to your original question, I know I've been going on for a bit here, but to your original question, I think right now, if you go to Google and you type in a Google search and you get that AI response that's at the top, you're using this technology right now. And so the fact, I think that it will become another tool for a lot of people in their everyday jobs. And the question is, how fast does that, and what sort of economic effects does that have on how people's jobs are, what employment looks like, and the future? I tend to think of it as on the scale, at least, of think about how different jobs are because of computers, but it might be a little bit more compressed time frame because the hardware distribution of computers was harder to get in, whereas everybody can kind of try these software tools right now, download them to your phone and use them.
Rick, what do you think then? There's a level, and Neil, you can answer this too, but there's this level of skepticism behind AI. And I think Bernie Sanders had some op-ed and he immediately cited a poll. We want to explore all perspectives here. And so, 55% of Americans, I've seen other polls too, like in Wisconsin, for example, 65% of Wisconsinites oppose new data center construction and things like that. And so what do you think drives the negative feelings behind AI?
Well, I mean, I think that there's fear of being replaced, right? I mean, I'm haunted by Tyler Cohen, an economist, wrote a book a few years back called Average is Over. And the thesis of this book was that technology would have a tendency to replace the jobs of those individuals who are just average, because those would be the type of tasks and the type of capabilities that would be most easily replicated by technology. And, we've seen that to some extent in the legal profession. I was interested in Neil's comment that, that this is not quite as new as we think it is. But, over the span of my career, when I was in law school, computer-aided legal research was just beginning. And, we did things in a very, very different way. We had libraries with all these books, and there were certain ways that you use these books in order to, track down case law. And it was very cumbersome and it was very time consuming. Fast forward, today, Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty has 12 lawyers who are involved in litigation, and we don't have a law library at the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. In fact, we have a lot of people who do most of their work at home because they can do it on a little $1,200 laptop. And this hasn't replaced lawyers, but it has changed the demand for lawyers. And so you don't need as many bodies, you don't need as many worker bees because, technology reduces the demand for that type of thing. There used to be a profession called legal secretary. It's pretty much gone now and has been replaced by paralegal, which is a completely different thing. And so you are worried, and I think people are, intrinsically worried that their jobs are going to be replaced, that they're going to become obsolete. Now, that's not new either, and it's not limited to computers. It used to be, if you go back 150 years ago, most Americans worked on farms. And then, technology advanced to a point where you didn't need that many people working on farms now. And so, very few people do. You then had industrialization. People worked in factories. Technology, not just, exports from overseas, but technology advanced to a point where you didn't need that many people working in factories anymore. And in each instance, the market adjusted to that, but is that going to happen again, right? There's a certain amount of uncertainty about that. And the jobs that are going to be lost are not necessarily just those ones that are on the sort of the lower end of the economic spectrum. There's going to be a lot of upper middle class and professional people that are affected by that. So I think that's one source of anxiety. And the other source of anxiety, I think, falls into the is it alive category. That is, will this stuff take over? Will this stuff turn against us? How could that possibly happen? Because obviously there's this process in which it comes up with at least what seem to be ideas of its own. I'm not sure that that's actually an accurate way to explain it, but this is sort of the science fiction scenario where, the machine turns against its creator.
I do want to stay on this that first realm, which is about replacement, and we've talked about the Industrial Revolution and jobs and how they've changed over time, and people are always fearful, but that it does seem like in some ways like capitalism comes to the rescue. But if you ask any I think true communists, they would tell you, well, this is what we've been waiting for happen. We've been waiting for the age of innovation to make capitalism collapse on itself and eliminate the middle class. I could just see that argument.
Marx said there'll be a time when you can fish in the morning and write poetry in the afternoon because there'll be no longer as much need for your labor.
Neil, what do you think about that trend?
The research that we're seeing about how AI affects employment is complicated, right? In part because this is a general purpose technology, which means it's going to have an effect on every single industry. But to Rick's point, the industries that this is affecting are, in many cases, they're much more in the knowledge worker stack. And that's why some of the most vibrant, angry people about this are people in some of the creative industries or in the journalistic industries. And those people have a lot of influence on cultural uptake as well. And so I think that is part of a feedback loop that's happening here. And so I think that we will continue to see a sort of backlash for these cultural reasons. But the research is suggesting, that jobs are bundles of tasks. And actually, if you think about your job, there are some clear tasks that you understand you could very well explain to somebody, but there's a bunch of tasks that actually you're not quite sure how you would even explain to somebody else how they would do that. Like when you choose what to do in the morning, or when you have the connection to somebody and you reach out and you call them. And so these bundles of tasks will be repackaged, I think, with this new technology. And what we're seeing is that there are some tasks where AI helps people level quickly, right? So in call centers, there's been some research that shows newer and less experienced call center agents can start to perform at a much better level if they have this assistance from the AI. They perform maybe more like a much more experienced call center agent. In other places, say scientific labs and research, it's the people who are already at the top of the skill set who benefit the most, because these tools are good at brainstorming, but they're not good at picking out what a good path might be for further research. And it's the most skilled people who can then take advantage of the fact that there's a bunch of ideas here and can quickly sort out which ones are good. And so I think it's going to be a pretty uneven, the researchers often call it a jagged effect here, where there will be some bundles of tasks that are very easy to substitute AI for, and there will be some bundles of tasks that are very hard, and you'll end up with different jobs. Rick's paralegal example is perfect, right? I remember when I first started at a law firm, I was sort of on the later end of that transition to computerized research. And so our office space was clearly designed for having all the lawyers on the outside, and then all the paralegals or legal secretaries in the middle. And there was nobody in those cubes, right? Like it was just the lawyers around the outside, right? And so institutions take a while even to like adjust to this technology. And that architecture example, I think, sort of suggests that nobody would design a law firm that way now, a space for a law firm. In fact, a lot of law firms are sort of much more virtual at this point. And so I think we will see that kind of evolution as well here. The Marx idea is sort of stands on the idea that humans will run out of problems to solve. And I think that humans are insatiable when it comes to wanting to solve problems or what they want. It would not be hard right now to fish in the morning and write poetry in the afternoon if you wanted to. People could do that, right? In fact, I think a lot of people could do that right now in the current world, but they don't choose to. They choose to do something else. And people want meaning in their life. It's a big, big universe. I think when people think about AI replacing all the jobs, they sort of think very small about what the jobs of humans are right now. The universe is a big place. There's lots of challenges to solve, lots of problems to solve. I think AI is going to let people solve problems in ways that they couldn't before, or express themselves in ways that they couldn't before. And I think it's also going to raise the premium of human face-to-face in a way that is going to make it more valuable. And so there's, Rick talked about the effect on demand. I don't think the demand for legal services is going to go down. I suspect it's gone up, and it will continue to go up. As something gets cheaper and easier to provide, the demand for it goes up. So I suspect that we will see a lot more lawyering, even if that doesn't mean that we see a lot more lawyers. And so that means that the supply of these types of services to people could go up, so that we have people who are now using legal services who just wouldn't have chosen to do that in the past because it wasn't worth it or it was too expensive.
Yeah, you can go on YouTube and you can find an old clips from an old TV show. I mean, I think it was Walter Cronkite who hosted it or something like that, and they were talking about the rise of computers and that, in the future, people would be able to work 20 hours a week. And it hadn't turned out that way because, the certainly in the legal profession, the capacity to get things done quicker has resulted in just more work being done, right? I mean, instead of doing the same thing in fewer hours, we do more things in the same number of hours. But there has been a change, I think, in there are winners and losers from this type of thing. And I think
Totally.
to some extent, the winners are those who are more at the top range of the skill set. But I do like Neil's point in the sense that there will be other things, there will be other types of occupations, other types of value and service that people provide to one another. When I was a kid, you didn't have nail salons, right? I mean, you got nail salons on every block now in a typical American city, but that didn't happen. Women did their own nails, right? And we became wealthier, and women entered the workforce, and this need to have somebody do this arose. I don't think when I was a kid, personal training was a thing, right? I mean, there weren't people that would go and help you exercise at the gym, but now they do.
Only for the most wealthy. I mean, that was the sort of thing, like you'd have to be like the top, Hollywood star to have like a person whose job was it to make sure your body was in shape, right?
Absolutely. And so maybe there will be new demands. There are new things that we couldn't dream really of having somebody do for us that or that we could do for somebody else, that those jobs will arise. But there'll be a transition period. Even under that happy scenario, there'll be a transition period, and there'll be winners and there'll be losers. And I think that there will be political challenges arising from that.
This idea that the winners and losers in a transition period, and this is one of the things I want to talk about, is like these entry level workers. The 3-5 people participating in putting this podcast together have all started somewhere and then risen to a level to then have more responsibility, higher salary, things like that. Maybe AI is eliminating that ladder of kind of working your way up somewhere. And I don't know if it's just that sort of entry level work will change, or what these younger people do to find that first job will change. But I'd be curious what both of you think about that.
I tend to think that we will see different jobs. And I think we've already seen this, right? The idea of a 40-year career where you're working for the same employer, like that used to be a thing. And it's much less a thing now as the economy has gotten more dynamic. And I don't think that there's a lot of entry-level kids right now who even see that as a vision of the life that they want. A lot of the people that I talk to who are exploring jobs in this space are interested in figuring out how they can do something that's meaningful with the talents that they have. And at least the kids that I encounter tend to be very focused on sort of intellectual pursuits, maybe in the legal or policy field or computer science. And for those types of careers, it is easier than ever to start cranking out output without having, a big structure around you. And that has pluses and minuses, right? Mentorship and the networks that you get from learning from somebody who's been in the game much longer means maybe you avoid a bunch of mistakes ahead of time, or you avoid very visible mistakes that I think is much easier to make now if you're just cranking out content as a beginner. On the other hand, it's a much more sort of dynamic environment that rewards people who want to work hard and do that. I think to Rick's point, this isn't going to be even. It's going to change who wins and loses from this. I think rather than learning from mentors in the same way of the past, where maybe your mentors are the people who are in the job that you have, I think it would behoove a lot of people to sort of assemble their own mentors who may be across a bunch of different spaces. And I think the technology can help do some of that, help connect people who have similar interests and basically who could benefit from interacting with each other. I think we can see that right now, rather than expecting that the sort of institutions that pre-exist are going to do that for us. I think it's much more of a self-directed world now.
These institutions too, like what we're talking about too, is like higher education. I think that that needs to be completely rethought of, and like how we're preparing people for the future. I mean, just you walk out of, I think 50 years ago or something, it was, have a degree and you'll be fine. I think that's just not a model that exists anymore.
You wonder though, when the internet really got going, I thought that what this is going to do is it's going to ruthlessly drive out intermediaries because there's less need. It's never like
Sure. Right.
it completely eliminates something. It's that it changes the balance of things, that it would eliminate intermediaries, and that one of the things you might do is there have to be fewer salespeople. I have a grandson who's graduating from college, and he's got one of these liberal arts degrees, and I'm of course worried that he's gonna wind up in a job where he asks somebody what he can get started for them. But he got a job in sales, and somebody explained to me, well, here's the thing. If you're good at this, if you have well-developed interpersonal skills, you're quite in demand right now, because we have a generation of people that's used to like staring at screens all day, and the level of interpersonal skill has declined. And so if you've got them, that makes you valuable, puts you in demand. And so sometimes there's a back to the future aspect of this. One possible outcome is that it makes the human more important, right? Which is one of the things that we fear it'll be anti-human, but maybe not in every way.
I think people sort of project that other people aren't going to have they internally are like, I value human communication, but obviously other people out there won't. And I worry about that. And I think that that's incorrect. I mean, you could see it's sort of like the idea that there was a lot of concern about what photography would do to painting. It used to be that the most skilled painters were the ones who could paint a extremely realistic, painting, portrait of somebody. And that's what people worked really hard to do. Photography just changed what people valued, right? Once every single person could get a extremely accurate portrait of themselves from a photographer, what they wanted out of art was something different than that. And what the artist wanted to produce was something different than that as well. And so I think that we can see even in the creative spaces that as the tools change, that also affects what people want and what people still want. And I think it's in human nature. They want human connection. They want a story. They want a narrative. They want those narratives to mean something. I don't think that that really changes with the introduction of this technology. I think what changes is how they get those narratives, what those look like, who makes them, maybe, and who benefits from making them. And that means a lot of change, but it's not a net negative change, I don't think, overall.
One of these questions we got to is how do we address this, the concern about this permanent underclass. And I think we talked a little bit about that. One of the solutions that's out there, though, from friends maybe on the left side of the spectrum, is this idea of universal basic income, and this idea that maybe in the transition period, that's a great solution for people who might get displaced, or maybe it's just furthering unemployment benefits. But is that going to create some sort of problem once people kind of fall into some sort of unemployment? They're kind of on the government dole, and or is universal basic income going to vastly expand that if we did go down that way?
Yeah, I'm not sure that that's the magic bullet that some people think it is. You certainly fulfill a need when you give somebody money, right? So then they can go and they can get the things that they need. But there are needs that you don't fill when you do that, right? People have this desire to be useful and to feel that they're doing something that is of value to other people. And so I think the notion that we can just have socialist paradise where, AI will generate so much money that, most of us can just retire at 28 or something like that. People would not be happy with that, no matter how much they may like the idea in the abstract. I think in practice, I don't think that's a particularly good way to live. So I think the whole thing is going to be more complicated than that. Maybe you wind up with some kind of universal basic income, although, all my free market tendencies sort of recoil at that, but that certainly can't be the solution.
I think the less fraught way to distribute benefits is if AI is going to produce a ton of value, that value is only expressed in the marketplace if people are demanding it, right? And so to me, what that suggests is that if there are huge efficiencies that are gained here, then prices should go down in a lot of things that we want. Or there should be a bunch of new innovative things that solve the problems that we want to solve. But if AI isn't solving problems for people, it's not useful. And I think the market would punish it. And so I think people sort of forget this, that somehow like they think that jobs are things that are done in the abstract, and they forget that jobs are only valuable if they're solving people's problems. And so AI will only be valuable if it's solving people's problems too. That means that more people are getting their problems solved if we have a more efficient technology. And so if that's true, then the benefits are getting distributed. Now, like I said, they may be distributed unevenly because AI might be really good at solving certain types of problems and less good at solving others. But there's a whole bunch of problems right now, for example, in the delivery of healthcare, say in rural communities that don't have that many doctors and can't have specialists, that this technology does seem very well posed to help solve. And those will be benefits that will be broadly felt, including potentially by people who have been disadvantaged thus far. And so we can look at the income side of things, but we can also look at the consumer side of things and say like AI could distribute like huge benefits this way as well. And so rather than, benefits programs that once introduced will be very hard politically to draw back, I would look at other ways to step through this gap, through training, through education, and using this as an opportunity, I think, to reform some of the institutions that are not serving us particularly well, including K-12 and maybe university level education.
Do you guys think that's maybe some of these industries? I look at healthcare right away. We spend a lot of time pushing for price transparency here at the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. And I think AI is going to, in some ways, make a lot of healthcare services cheaper. But, these folks have government affairs people. They have lobbyists to push for guardrails and regulations. and AI is relatively unpopular with the American people, I think, in general, just because it's so new. And so the time to regulate it, politically speaking, is now. And so, Neil, I don't know if you wanted to start first as far as what do you think is the role of government here to regulate the AI sections of the economy?
I think there is a role here. This is a technology, again, that is general purpose. And so its deployment in a lot of sectors is already going to be affected by existing law. So in the healthcare sector, there's a bunch of laws that apply that don't really care about what technology you're using. They care about the sort of outputs and the process by which those tools are used. And some of those laws are going to be valuable in continuing the protection. Some of them will actually be challenges to deploy this technology into this space. I'm thinking in particular, we have a very outdated concept of health information privacy, and the HIPAA laws that at the federal level, and I think states have some as well, make it very challenging actually to deploy some of this technology in a way that would benefit consumers, even though the privacy practices don't really benefit the privacy processes that we have. Are their main cost. Their main cost is basically checking a lot of forms when you go to the doctor every single time about collecting your information. And so I think that there are big benefits we could get in this space in these various sectors. And the government's role will be to say, like, hey, this is a new technology. What gaps in our existing law in healthcare or in government procurement or in law enforcement and private civil rights, what gaps are there in the law that are exposed by this technology? Where do we need to fill those in? But a lot of the approaches have been sort of, let's regulate the technology like in an overarching way. And I think that probably is miscalibrated. I think we should focus on regulating the technology as applied in healthcare or as applied in transportation or as applied in education, because that will help us figure out whether or not there's actual gaps to fill first and then fill those gaps. I think that's an important role. And so that'd be the approach I would suggest that I think will be calibrated the best, even if it seems like we should regulate the technology as a whole from the top down.
Rick, what do you think? I mean, you founded an organization to push back on, I think, in a lot of ways, like the power of government, especially over the free market. And so I'd be interested what you have to say.
I always like to say, that we are in favor of free markets, but the nature of market competition is that there always have to be some rules, right? You have to be able to enforce contracts. Sometimes regulations that reduce uncertainty and promote trust are worthwhile. To some extent, my bigger question about regulating AI beyond what needs to be done is to ask whether Congress can act at all anymore, since they don't particularly seem getting the simplest things done seems to be almost too much for them. But I mean, I think that there are questions around AI generated images and how you should you regulate that? There's tension there, possibly with the First Amendment. I just read kind of a scary article about new AI technology, which is essentially creates a super hacker, like somebody who can, has this like almost unstoppable capability of defeating computer security systems. And what are you going to do about that? Is there anything that the government can do about that? There seems to be a lot of questions out there that really only experts are grappling with, right? And these are not part of the public conversation, right? The public conversation is all given over to other things, and we have these sort of major issues that could probably use some attention, but they're difficult, they're complicated, they're a little scary, and right now we don't even seem to be talking about them.
There's tons of interest in regulating AI. I think state lawmakers have introduced, I think it's close to 2,000 laws since the beginning of January for this session that affect AI or are aimed at regulating AI in some way. And Congress has introduced a lot of laws too, although to Rick's point, it hasn't passed very many. It's passed a few. So there is that gap that Rick is talking about between the political interest and the sort of demands to do something and the expertise needed to do something that's effective. And I think that a lot of this problem can be solved, not all of it, but a lot of it can be solved if legislators and regulators, their first question is, which harm am I worried about? Like, what outcome am I worried about? Because harms don't change that fast. The types of things that we as humans care about, financial harm, physical harm, maybe reputational harm, those are long lasting, even if the technologies used to deliver those harms are changing quickly. And so I think if lawmakers can focus on that first question, like, what harm am I trying to solve? And then how does current law approach this harm? How does AI change that approach, and what do we need to do? I think even without deep technical expertise, we can get a long way down to that path towards what would good regulation look like by asking some of those simple questions up front, and working down. Rick's the point on cybersecurity, I think, is a particularly good one. I think it's driven by Anthropic, one of the big AI model developers had released Mythos, or had talked about releasing Mythos, which is their new AI model. And in talking about that, they've decided to hold back from publicly releasing it because they're working with a bunch of companies to deploy it, because it's very good at identifying what are called zero-day vulnerabilities in software. These are flaws that had never been identified by a human before. And this type of technology is it's a two-edged, it's both a sword and a shield, right? Like, if you get it first, it's going to make it easy for us to identify and fix a lot of problems that otherwise would just be hanging out there that we didn't know about, that somebody might be able to take advantage of. But my bigger point is that it would be hard if you don't have any expertise to see that both ways, right? That this is both a defensive technique and it's an offensive technique. And that if we don't get the regulation right, we might put the thumb on the scale in a way that actually stops the defensive ability of these companies to be able to roll out something that's going to help make everybody's computers more secure. And instead, we might, we might stop us from being able to develop that, say, here in the US. Our laws obviously don't apply overseas to China, North Korea, other places. And so it could potentially make us more vulnerable if we don't get our regulatory system right here in the US.
Two takeaways from what Neil just said. And the last one is that, I think it would be just so much better if we just stopped all this AI stuff. You just can't call the whole thing off because nobody has the capability to end it. And so this is a reality now that has to be lived with. The second part is with respect to the regulatory framework, it would be helpful if lawmakers could understand that there are limits to what they can anticipate and limits to what they can do. And so they ought to stick to knitting. And I think saying, okay, what harm am I supposed to, do I want to prevent? Do I think I can prevent? Is a better approach than saying, I'm going to, we are going to now create from scratch the AI utopia, and we have the ability and we have the foresight and we have the knowledge to do that. In all likelihood, they don't.
The question I have on some of this regulation stuff, though, is like, we talked about cybersecurity, and I think, but we're coming up on an election that the left might do quite well. They have fears with AI, including pollution, is one of probably their biggest one. Job replacement, we talked a little bit about that. And obviously tax breaks for like data centers and things like that, I think is shared by both the left and right in this case. But any of those, those seem to be something that would be to put the brakes on AI. And so I'm curious, Rick or Neil, where do we think, are we concerned about that? Because I think there's a reason to be.
I do worry about the instincts to resist new technological change, which is a left impulse in academia, especially, that I've seen across my entire policy career, that the emphasis in academia on technology is the threats that it brings. Often these are phrased as threats to interests that are appealing to the left. The environmental one, I think, in this space is way out of proportion to the actual threat. You'll hear all these conversations about the effect of data centers on water. AI data centers use far less water and have far less effect on water than, agriculture, by far, by far. I mean, it's not even close. And so I think if you had even all of Google's data centers for the next 10 years, I think the amount of water that they are going to use is less than the average farm in the Midwest, right? And so it's just that concern in particular, I think, is way overblown, but it does play very well to the left, and it builds on a constituency around environmental action that has been looking for a new villain for a while. So I think that's more of a narrative play. Some of the other stuff, I mean, I think the left and the right are both concerned about job effects. They want to see action around that. They're curious about that. I think the left in particular in AI is concerned about what they call algorithmic bias. They're worried that these tools will be used in a way that will, hold back, disadvantaged communities and promote, advantaged communities. And I think that is a lot of that. We saw a lot of that concern expressed under the Biden administration. I think that is a thread throughout the left. And so I would expect to see people wanting to put the brakes on some of this stuff from the left under the next Congress. Although the biggest concern for me is that there are concerns on lots of different sides that I think, as people are unfamiliar with the technology, there's a lot of bipartisan consensus and concern overall. And so my job is to get them more familiar with the technology and the potential benefits before we put into place structures that will be very hard to remove.
What about the conversation on these tax breaks for data centers? Government kind of handing out, these in a tax break in a way, and we see a candidate for governor here, saying we're going to stop all of this if I'm elected. I think it will be interesting, I think, to see, because if some states do this and other states not, well, then some states will be home for innovation and some won't, right?
Yeah, I mean, I have, a certain amount of bias against subsidy, right? I mean, if something is really valuable, then it ought not to need a subsidy. It gets complicated because, you have, particularly in this idea of building energy transmission capacity in particular, you've got public utilities involved, so it's not really a straight up market proposition. You do have, I suppose, this kind of beggar thy neighbor problem, which, exists where, states are competing against one another. And one of the ways they do that is by providing the subsidies. My own view is that that's not nearly as effective as politicians think it is. They do it because it's a thing that they can do and then allows them to take credit for something. I don't know that subsidies are the way to do this, or they're even particularly necessary to do this, because I think that there is, I mean, we have the market soaring because everybody thinks AI is going to be the source of, profits hither that have never been seen, and it may very well. And so it doesn't strike me as a candidate for a lot of subsidies, but I suppose the devil is in the details with respect to any particular one.
I think, to your point, they're also incredibly politically unpopular. And so, we've seen some of the major hyperscalers, data center constructors, sign a pledge that basically says they won't take these, that they will cover their energy costs, right? And so I think that is, to Rick's point, cash is not the main constraint facing these companies. They are well capitalized. I think what they're more interested in is, permitting environments that let them build, that allow them an energy supply that lets them, that they can use. I think they are well aware that it's politically unpopular. It would be very politically unpopular if they drove up the costs of residential electricity prices, and I think they're working very hard to not do that. And so I think that there's lots that goes into these decisions. I don't think subsidizing them on the tax side is necessary or important, or I think politically it's quite costly, actually.
I'm sitting right now about 25 miles north of Milwaukee, along Lake Michigan. If you go another 10 miles, there's a little community called Port Washington, and that community has been ripped apart over the construction of data centers and
Yeah.
the building of the transmission lines to serve it. And I would say that, there is just a great, as is generally the case in politics today, there's a great deal of mistrust. I was struck by you saying, well, they're trying to work to keep down their impact on residential rates. And I think what we would hear in Port Washington is a lot of people saying, we don't believe you.
Yep.
And whether it's true or not, they would simply say, we don't believe you.
Yeah. And I think we're seeing that on the environmental effects side too. I think they just don't believe that even though these use this is not an industrial warehouse. They're using water for cooling. They're not like
Yeah, I mean, I've seen the statistics that it's the equivalent of, 6 swimming pools or something like that. I mean, this just does not seem to be an issue.
Yeah.
I do want to jump into one last question before we get to our closing segment, which is this idea of what can AI do to maybe help government be more accountable or more helpful to people? Rick, I want to start with you because obviously Congress is pretty broke. Well, a couple podcast episodes ago, we talked about that and how they haven't really passed anything in a long time and done the job that the Constitution kind of laid out for them. What could AI, do you think, is there anything AI could do to help make people, even if it's just get along? I don't know.
You mean assist Congress?
How can AI help our government improve the job it's doing? Or do you not think that could happen?
Well, in theory, right? I mean, one of the things that AI does, and the computers have been doing, for a generation, is to allow people to aggregate and analyze information much more quickly. So, in theory, AI should be able to help us resolve disputes about things. But it's hard to look at the last 30 years and say that that's actually happened. And, you fear sometimes now that we kind of live in a post-truth era where, everybody's view of the facts is sort of determined by their ideological priors, and it's very, very difficult to move them off of it, even with, powerful tools that can, do things like, analyze 1,000 studies and summarize where they are. But in theory, right? In theory, if we fix ourselves, we should be able to use machines in a way that benefit our political discourse. Right now, the level of polarization and distrust is so high, and is high both on the left and the right, who have, I think, in many ways, and this is a point I like to make, have increasingly come to resemble each other.
Neil, go ahead, but I think that's a great point.
So I think in the basic operation of government, where it actually interacts with people, there's a lot of potential. Some of this is just the old tale as old as time of government adopting new technologies, which it's not the fastest at doing, but the potential here to increase the speed and reliability of basic services, constituent services at the local, state, and even the federal level, I think is enormous. It will take some effort, some investment, and it will take creating the right incentives for those existing institutions to evolve. That's hard. That's hard often. I think in the bigger picture, the political questions, the question to me is, how does AI change the incentives of the people involved? And I think there are some ways in which AI can do that. Part of the incentive structure that we have right now is because of the media environment that we have, which is directly downstream from technological change, social media, the erosion of, a sort of quasi monopoly on narrative at the national level from a few media sources. That has fragmented in the social media era. I think we're seeing some initial research that suggests that interacting with AI models is more of it has the opposite effect. Whereas social media sort of like presses the polarizing buttons, it's easier to get your message out the more extreme it is because people react to it. Interacting with AI models tends to have more of a compressing effect that eliminates the fringes and pushes people more towards, like I would say, the middle of a set of debates. And so if you talk to any of these models, they're just because of how they're developed on a mass amount of data, they're going to tend to push more towards the center, right, over time. And there's some variation, but even all the models that we've seen cut off at the extremes. Like they push back on the extreme positions the most. They push back less on the middle. Now that can be good. That can be bad. It certainly will have an effect, but that effect won't really be observable. I don't think from like the top. It will be in how it changes how society talks to each other and what pressures the political operatives are having from those sort of grassroots changes in conversation. And I don't think that's a very satisfying answer, but I do think that there is some potential here. I would expect to see changes in the incentives that politicians have. I don't know if they're going to be for the better or for the worse, but I think they will be different than the era in which technology was primarily dominated by social media debates.
I have to say, though, there's a significant number of people on the right who think that AI is biased against conservatives.
That's right.
And there are a lot of people on the left that I suspect think it's biased against left progressives.
Yep.
So, it's this, all this can be true, but there's this ongoing question of, whether people are going to believe their lion eyes or their predispositions. And
Yep.
they seem to favor their predispositions.
I've written some about this and why, in some ways, this argument favors the right, in part because the types of bias that conservatives are concerned about is bias that's explicit, right? Where the companies are allegedly putting a thumb on the scale against conservative ideas, whereas the type of bias that liberals are concerned about is implicit bias that is sort of in the training data, right? They're worried about the bias of society against certain people. And that is much harder to solve technically than the concerns that conservatives have, which is much more easy to observe. It's much more easy to correct for, frankly. And so I'm somewhat positive on this bias conversation ultimately working out. And I think as more people use it, as more people use these technologies, I think they'll start to realize, like, if you think of interacting with these chatbots as a conversation, their first answer is going to be pretty normie, centrist, center left, maybe, because it's sort of the average of the internet. But if you push it, you can get it to take on it has all of this in the training data. So if you're like, well, rephrase that from a libertarian point of view or rephrase that from a socialist point of view, all of these models can do that, and they will for the most part. And so I think as people become more familiar with it, they'll be familiar with how they can correct the bias at an individual level, which I think is very helpful.
We will still get ChatGPT saying that our newsletter violates some of its terms of service. I will say that based on some of the cases we take. Rick didn't know that, but I'll just let him know. I just let him know now.
I didn't need to know that.
So I do want to end with our final segment, which is, and I think this ties in really well. We talked about how AI in historical context too, but it's like, those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it. And so, we're huge history fans. Rick's a huge history buff. I love history myself. We are all about, it's America's 250th birthday this year. What is a moment in time you think we are doomed to repeat?
So every single time there's been a major technological development, it reframes how people think about society as well. So the Industrial Revolution is a great example. I've been listening to a book just called The History of England, which is terrific. And the amazing thing about England going through the Industrial Revolution was that they were the first country to really go through it. And so there was no obvious other side to it, which I think drove a lot of the concerns in that country. Whereas some of the countries that followed on, they had already seen England go through it, right? And so there was more of an assurance that, hey, we're going to make it through. There is another side to this thing. And the Industrial Revolution changed how people thought about society. It changed how the elites thought about what science and what good science looked like. And so you saw all the metaphors coming out of the Industrial Revolution for society as an engine or a machine that needs to be designed, tweaked. You can throttle up, you can throttle down. There's a very command and control idea, and that played out in how the rise of the administrative state. It shaped how governance looked because of that metaphor and that idea that science was about something that you could take apart, you could redesign, you could make a better one, and then press go and and manage it. I think we're doomed to repeat that here, right? We are going to think there will be people who think of society as a whole as a computer or as a maybe a machine learning algorithm, and they will think, well, what does that mean for how we design our governance? And I think that metaphor, we're doomed to like over apply that metaphor in a way that I think will have some challenges. I don't know every way that will play out, but we're doomed. We're very much doomed to do that.
For sure. Absolutely. Rick, go ahead.
Well, I'm a big fan of, Bill Buckley's statement that a conservative is someone who stands athwart history yelling stop. But I actually see that more as an admonition to sort of preserve the best of what's gone before. And I don't really see it as calling for stasis with respect to technology. We moved from more of an agricultural society to an industrial society. There's messiness in that. There's need to accommodate and address the short-term harm that often causes. I don't know whether there's reason to think that this is going to be different than every other change in the past. I'm not even sure there's reason to think that this is going to be quite as momentous as we think it is. But I guess I kind of agree that there's going to be this continued messiness, fear and concern. I think this is a little bit what's beyond, and I think could exacerbate the rise of populism on the left and the right. And I don't know that. I think that's just going to happen. It's just in the nature of things.
Well, thank you guys for an incredible conversation on something. I think that's just, as we know, it's here. It's not going anywhere. It's changing our economy. It's changing how people see their government, see capitalism, and all the above. So, thanks again for an incredible episode. As you know, you can find us at will-law.org/podcast or wherever you get your podcast. We definitely will revisit the AI topic again. There's no way that you can cover everything in one episode. So, Neil, thanks for joining us today. And to all of our listeners, Rick and I will be back with you soon.